Frost came before the light did that morning, and it came the way it always came to Marlow Fen, low and grey and smelling of wood smoke and wet wool, and the river 3 streets down freezing at its edges. The market square was already half full of carts and half empty of buyers. Breath hung over the stalls like a second, thinner fog. She was the kind of woman a crowd closed over without noticing. Not because she was plain, though she was, but because she made herself small on purpose, the way a person learns to when there is never quite enough to go around, and asking for a share of it feels like theft. Miriam Calder was 26, a vicar's daughter with no vicar left to claim her, and her one true skill lived in her hands. She could set a hem so it lay flat as still water. She could turn a worn collar, and no one would ever know it had been turned. It was not a grand gift. It kept her and her daughter fed most weeks. This was not going to be one of the fed weeks. She knew it before she reached the baker's stall, knew it from the weight of the coin purse against her palm, 3 pennies and a clipped groat. And she knew it from the way her daughter's hand had gone very still in hers, the stillness of a child old enough to understand hunger and young enough to hope it might be argued with. Beth was 7. She had her father's chin and her mother's habit of not complaining, and this morning she had not eaten, and neither had Miriam, and there was a loaf of bread in the bottom of Miriam's basket that had to last them both until Friday. Something in this square was going to change before the bells rang noon. If you are still here with me, staying through these long, quiet mornings and long, quiet stories, do one small thing for me before we go further into this one. Subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story finds you too. Now back to the frost, and the bread and the boy no one else in that square seemed to see. He was crouched against the base of the well, small enough that a woman with a basket of turnips nearly walked into him and did not apologize. He wore no shoes. His feet had gone the colour of the stone he sat on. He could not have been more than 5, and he was not crying, which was somehow worse than if he had been, because a child who has learned not to cry has learned it the same hard way Miriam had. Miriam stopped walking. Across the square, in the shadow of a broken-down travelling carriage, whose wheel a smith was still swearing over, a man in a plain grey coat stood with a boy of 7 at his side. The coat had no crest on it. The boots were good but unpolished, the boots of a man who had ridden hard and did not care who knew it. He was not looking at the smith or the wheel. He was looking, as his son was looking, at the woman with the basket and the child at the well. The boy tugged his father's sleeve. "Father," he said, very low, the way children say the things they are not certain they are permitted to say. "They haven't eaten. Look at her hands. Look how she's holding the basket like it's heavier than it is." The man in grey said nothing. He watched. Miriam knelt by the well, and she did not think about it, because thinking about it would have given her time to decide against it, and she had learned long ago that decisions made slowly by a hungry person are decisions made by the hunger and not by the person. She opened the basket. She broke the loaf in half, and then broke that half again, and put 3 parts of it into the boy's cupped hands, and kept only the smallest for herself and Beth to split between them. "Eat slowly," she told him. "It will feel like more that way." The boy ate the way starving things eat, fast and frightened, as though the food might be taken back. Miriam did not watch him do it. She had enough grace left, even hungry, to look away and let him have that much privacy in his want. She took her own shawl off next, the blue one, her mother's, thin at the elbows, and patched twice at the hem, and she wrapped it around his bare feet, because she had nothing else to wrap them in, and she said nothing about the cold that came up through her own sleeves the moment the wool left her shoulders. Beth watched her mother do this without protest. She did not ask why they had none of the bread themselves. She had learned, at 7, not to ask questions with answers that would only make her mother's face do the thing it did when there was no good answer to give. The man in grey had not moved. His son had gone quiet beside him, watching with the particular stillness of a child witnessing something he does not yet have the words for, and will spend years trying to find. Miriam did not look up and see them. She never learned, not that morning, that she had been seen at all. She believed, as she rose and settled the empty basket on her arm and took her daughter's cold hand in her own colder one, that the square had gone on about its business, entirely blind to her, that the only witnesses to what she had done were a beggar boy too hungry to remember faces, and a well too old to care. She did not know then that the man in the plain grey coat was Nathaniel Hale, 9th Duke of Alderley, and that he had come to Marlow Fen that morning for no reason he could have named beyond restlessness and a broken wheel, and that what he had just watched a stranger do, with her last bread and her only shawl, would follow him home, and would not leave him, not for a long while, not until it had changed the shape of both their lives. Miriam took Beth's hand and walked toward the lane that led home, and the wind found her shoulders where the shawl had been, and she did not shiver where anyone could see it. She had trained herself out of that a long time ago. Cold that showed was cold that invited pity, and pity was a debt she had no way to repay. Behind her, the boy at the well finished the bread and looked up to find the woman gone, and looked instead at the strange, quiet man across the square, who was already turning to his son with a question in his face that had no easy answer. "Do you know her?" Nathaniel asked. "No, father, neither do I," he said. "But I mean to." He did not say why. He did not entirely know why himself, not yet, only that something in him, some old cold room he had shut the door on 2 years before, had just had its window opened a crack, and the draught coming through it smelled of frost and bread, and a woman who had given away everything she had to a child who could never thank her for it. The smith called that the wheel was mended. Nathaniel did not answer at first. He was still watching the lane where she had gone, memorizing nothing about her face, because he had not gotten close enough to see it clearly, only the line of her back, straight under a weight most people would have let bow them, and the particular way she had knelt in the cold without seeming to notice the cold at all. "Father," Oliver said again. "Are we going home?" soon Nathaniel said. "First I want to know her name." He did not ask it of her. He asked it, an hour later, of the woman who kept the linen accounts at the coaching inn, a woman who knew every soul in Marlow Fen by the debts they owed and the debts owed them, and who answered without much thought, because the Duke of Alderley asking after a poor seamstress was to her mind only the kind of idle question great men sometimes asked about the small people beneath them, and would come to nothing. She was wrong about that. She would be wrong about it for the rest of her life, and would tell the story afterward, at the inn, for years, of the morning she had told a duke a name, and not known she was handing him the whole of his future. Miriam Calder did not eat that day either. Not properly. She gave Beth the last of the bread, and told her own stomach it had managed on less before. She mended 3 shirts for the miller's wife by candlelight, and took payment in a wedge of cheese and a promise of more work in the spring, and she went to sleep with her daughter's cold feet tucked against her own and thought, before she slept, of the boy at the well, and hoped, without any expectation of ever knowing, that he had found somewhere warm to be that night. She did not think of the man in grey at all. She had never truly seen him. It would be some weeks before she understood how thoroughly he had seen her. The rider came to the Calder cottage on the 4th day after, a groom in Alderley livery, with a letter sealed in plain wax, no crest pressed into it, which struck Miriam as odd before she had even broken the seal. The letter was short. It offered mending work at Alderley Hall, 3 days a week, wages fair and paid in coin at the week's end, and it was signed not by the Duke but by a Mrs. Pruitt, housekeeper, who wrote in a hand as blunt and practical as a hinge. Miriam read it twice. She had done nothing to earn such an offer that she knew of. She had mended no gowns for great houses, had no connections there, had never in her life set foot past the Alderley gate. "Why would they want me?" she said, half to Beth, half to the cold room, when there must be a dozen seamstresses in the county with better names than mine. Beth, who was 7 and had not yet learned to distrust good fortune, only shrugged and asked if they would have meat that week. They did. Miriam took the position because a family that skips meals does not turn down honest wages to ask why they were offered, and she told herself, walking the 3 miles to the hall on her first morning, that the why of it did not matter, only the doing of the work well enough to keep it. She was not to know that the Duke of Alderley had sat in his study 4 nights, running with her name written on a scrap of paper before him, turning it over the way another man might turn over a coin he could not decide whether to spend. She was not to know that he had asked Mrs. Pruitt, carefully, without ever once explaining why, to find quiet work for a seamstress named Calder, work that would bring her within the walls of his house, without bringing her within the reach of gossip, work that would let him watch, at a distance, whether the woman in the square had been a single act of grace, or the whole shape of her character. He told himself this was prudence. A man in his position could not simply summon a stranger to his house on the strength of one morning's kindness witnessed from across a market square. He told himself he was testing something, verifying it, the way a steward verifies a tenant's word before extending credit. He did not, in those 4 nights, let himself examine too closely why his chest had gone tight and strange at the memory of a woman kneeling in frost to warm a stranger's child, or why he had caught himself, twice, describing the line of her back to no one, in an empty room, as though someone might be listening who cared. Mrs. Pruitt, for her part, asked no questions she was not paid to ask, which was one of the reasons the Duke trusted her above every other soul in the house. She had kept Alderley's keys for 11 years, had buried the old Duke and welcomed the new one, had watched a young wife come to the house cold and leave it, 2 years later, colder still, and had never once repeated to a living soul the things she saw that were not hers to tell. She looked at Miriam Calder on her first morning, at the neat mend of her own cuffs, at the steadiness of her hands, despite the obvious poverty beneath her nails, and she thought, privately, that His Grace had chosen well, whatever it was he thought he was choosing. "You'll take the small sewing room, Mrs., Pruitt told her. "North light. Best for the eyes. You'll have your dinner in the servants' hall, same as everyone, and nobody here will trouble you about where you come from, so long as you don't trouble them about it either." "Thank you," Miriam said. "Don't thank me. Thank whoever put your name on Cook's list, because it wasn't me that thought of it." Miriam did not press. A woman who has learnt to accept what little kindness comes her way without demanding an account of its source is not a woman who pries at gift horses, and besides, there was work to be done. A basket of linens waiting, needles already threaded by some tidy soul who had known she was coming. She did not see the Duke that first week. She heard of him, the way servants hear of the master of a house, in fragments, that he was grave, that he rarely smiled, that he had lost his wife 2 winters past, and had not been quite the same man since, that he doted in his silent way on his son, and on almost nothing else. She formed no picture of him beyond that. He was a distant weather system, something that governed the house without ever entering the room she worked in, and she was glad of it, because a woman mending shirts for wages does better not to think too hard about the man whose name is on the deed. She met him properly on the 9th day, and it happened by accident, the way most true meetings do. Oliver had torn the sleeve of his good coat, climbing a wall he had been told 12 times not to climb, and Mrs. Pruitt, in a hurry, sent him direct to the sewing room, rather than waiting for the linens to be collected in the ordinary course of things. He arrived breathless, sleeve flapping, and behind him, unhurried, came his father, because the boy had run off before Nathaniel could finish scolding him, and a duke does not shout down his own hallways after a 7-year-old. Miriam looked up from her work and saw, for the first time in the light of her own small room, the man who had stood across the square 9 days before. She did not know him. She had never truly seen his face that morning, only his coat and his stillness. What she saw now was a tall, grave man with a face that had been carved rather than softened, a nose that had clearly been broken once and set without much ceremony, and eyes so dark a brown they read nearly black in the north light. He did not look at her the way great men sometimes looked at seamstresses, as though she were a piece of the furniture that happened to speak. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about and did not expect to meet so plainly. "Your Grace," she said, and rose, and did not curtsy, because her hands were full of pins and there was nowhere to set them fast enough, and afterwards she worried she had given offence. He did not seem to mind. "Sit," he said. "Finish what you're doing. My son's sleeve isn't going anywhere. No, Your Grace." Oliver held out his arm with the particular solemnity of a boy who believes his ruined coat is a matter of grave importance. Miriam turned the sleeve in her hands, found the tear, and began to work, and because her hands were occupied and her eyes were on the cloth, she found it easier to speak plainly than she might have otherwise. "You'll want to stop climbing that wall," she told him, not looking up. "Or wear a coat you don't mind losing, one or the other." Oliver grinned. "Father says the same thing." "Your father is right then, he's not. Usually he's too serious to be right about anything fun." "Oliver," Nathaniel said, but there was no real correction in it, only the ghost of something that might, on a less guarded man, have been amusement. Miriam glanced up at that, quick, and saw it the almost smile, gone as fast as it came, and something in her chest did an unfamiliar small thing, noted and set aside, because a seamstress does not build castles out of a duke's half-smile. "There," she said, and bit the thread, and handed the coat back. "It'll hold." "Thank you," Nathaniel said. "It was nothing, Your Grace, a torn sleeve. I didn't mean the sleeve." She looked up at that, uncertain what he did mean, and he did not explain himself, only held her eyes a moment longer than courtesy required, and then took his son's hand and left the room, and Miriam sat very still for a moment after the door closed, turning the strange weight of that sentence over in her mind and finding no bottom to it. She did not know that he had, that same evening, written to the coaching inn to settle a debt she had never told him existed, an old grocer's account her late husband had left unpaid before his death. 3 years of small sums owed and quietly forgiven, on the condition, given firmly and without room for negotiation, that the grocer never say from whom the payment came. She had 4 days of ordinary quiet after that, mending in the north light, walking home each evening, past hedgerows going brown with the turning season, and in those 4 days she began, without quite admitting it to herself, to listen for his step in the hall. The rest of that season went the way seasons go when a house is holding its breath. Winter loosened by degrees. Miriam's hours at the hall grew, first to 4 days a week, then 5, and though no one told her outright why the work had increased, she noticed that Mrs. Pruitt had begun finding reasons to send her to rooms where the Duke was often to be found, a torn curtain in the library, a loose button on a coat left on a chair in the small parlour. And she noticed, too, that she did not mind the pattern of it, whatever its cause. They spoke, in those weeks, the way 2 careful people speak when neither is certain what the other one wants. He asked her once, plainly, how she had come to sewing, and she told him without embellishment that her father had been a vicar with no money and less sense about keeping it, that her husband had died 3 years back of a fever that took half the village with him, that she had a daughter and a pair of capable hands, and had built a small life out of both. "You never speak of hardship as hardship," he said. "What good would it do to speak of it as anything else? Most people would ask for sympathy." "Sympathy doesn't mend a hem," she said. "I'd rather have the work." He was quiet a moment, the kind of quiet that in another man might have meant boredom, and in him meant the opposite. "I find," he said finally, "that I believe every word you say. It's a rarer thing than you'd think, in this house." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and he did not press her to, and the silence between them sat easy rather than awkward, which was, she was beginning to understand, the particular gift he had, though he seemed to think himself a hard and humourless man. He was not hard. He was careful. There was a difference, and she was coming, slowly, to see it. He told her once, in a rare unguarded hour by the library fire, while she mended a torn cushion cover, and he pretended to read, that his late wife had married him for the house and the name, and had never once, in 5 years, asked him a question about himself that was not really a question about his usefulness to her. "I did not know," he said, "that a marriage could be so quiet and still be so loud with the things unsaid in it." Miriam did not offer comfort. She only said, "That sounds lonely." It was. "I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me what to listen for." He looked at her then, steady, unhurried. "I find I'm listening for it now." She did not ask what he meant. She thought she understood, and the understanding frightened her a little, the way good things sometimes frighten people who have not been given many of them. Meanwhile, small kindnesses kept finding their way to her door, and she began, slowly, to notice the pattern of them without yet guessing the source. A basket of coal left with no note the week the frost turned hard again. A pair of good boots, small enough for a girl of 7, set outside her cottage door one morning, with nothing but a folded scrap of paper that read only, "For the child," and no signature at all. She asked at the hall who might have sent such things. No one professed to know. Mrs. Pruitt, asked directly, only said, "Someone with more money than sense, and less need to be thanked for spending it, and would not be drawn further," though her eyes, Miriam thought, had gone carefully blank in a way that suggested she knew a great deal more than she was saying. Spring came on slow, the way it did in that country, mud before green, and with it came Lady Judith Farrow, the late Duchess's elder sister, who arrived at Alderley Hall the first week of March with 4 trunks and the settled conviction that the house and the boy in it, and very likely the Duke as well, wanted a firmer hand than a grieving widower could provide. She was not, on first meeting, unkind. She was worse than unkind. She was correct, in the particular way that makes cruelty sound like good sense. She swept through the hall reorganising what did not need reorganising, and on the second day of her visit, passing the small sewing room, she stopped in the doorway, and looked at Miriam the way a woman looks at a stain she is deciding whether to have removed, or simply to avoid mentioning in company. "You're the seamstress," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lady. You have a child, I understand." "A daughter." "Yes, my lady. How resourceful of you," Lady Judith said, "to secure such steady work in a house like this. One wonders how you managed it, with no connections to speak of." She let the pause sit long enough to be understood. One does wonder. Miriam kept her hands moving on the seam in her lap. She did not look up right away, because she needed the moment to keep her voice level, and when she did look up, her voice came out plain and even. "I manage it the way anyone manages honest work, my lady. I do it well, and I ask for nothing beyond my wages." How admirably humble. Lady Judith's laugh was a small bright thing, 3 practised beats, the sound of a woman who had learned long ago that laughter could be sharpened into a weapon, and used it the way other women used a fan. Though humility is easier, I find, when one has so little to be proud of. Miriam said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that would not cost her more than it earned her, and she had learned in 3 years of widowhood exactly how much a poor woman's pride was worth in a rich woman's house, which was to say, nothing at all that could be spent, only something to be guarded. Lady Judith's eyes dropped, deliberately, to Miriam's hands, red-knuckled from cold water and coarse thread, chapped at the first joint of every finger. "Such hands," she said, almost gently, which made it worse. "One can always tell a woman's whole history from her hands, don't you find? Mine have never done a day's rough work in their lives." She held them up, briefly, pale and soft as evidence, and let them fall. "It shows, doesn't it? Everything shows in the end." "Yes, my lady," Miriam said, "it does." She did not say what showed on Lady Judith's own hands, which was nothing at all, and she thought, privately, that a life spent proving one had never worked was a strange thing to hold up as a virtue. But she kept the thought behind her teeth, because keeping thoughts behind her teeth was another one of the competencies poverty had taught her, alongside hymns and turned collars, and the exact weight of pride a person could afford to spend in a single day. Lady Judith was not finished. "I understand my nephew has taken a fondness to you," she said. "Children attach easily to novelty. I would not read too much into it if I were you, and I would certainly not," here her voice dropped, cool and final, "mistake his father's ordinary courtesy for anything warmer. Nathaniel is scrupulously kind to everyone beneath him. It is one of his better qualities. It is also, I think, sometimes mistaken by people in reduced circumstances for something it is not." "I've mistaken nothing, my lady. See that you continue not to." Lady Judith smiled, the 3 bright beats again, and swept from the room, and left behind her a silence that pressed on Miriam's chest like a hand. She did not cry. She had trained herself long ago not to cry where anyone might see the evidence of it, and there was no one to see it now but the cushion cover in her lap, which received, in the following hour, some of the finest and most furious needlework of her life, every stitch driven a little harder than it strictly needed to be. Nathaniel found her that way, an hour later, when he came to collect the mended cushion himself rather than send a maid, and he did not need to be told what had passed in that room. Lady Judith's visits left a particular temperature behind them, one he had learned to read the way sailors read weather. "What did she say to you?" he asked. Not "was there trouble?" Not "are you well?" He asked it as a man asking for a fact he intended to act on. "Nothing that wasn't true, Your Grace." "That isn't an answer. It's the only one I have." He studied her a long moment. "She has a gift," he said finally, "for saying cruel things in a register that sounds like kindness. I have spent a good part of my life learning to hear the difference. I would rather you didn't have to learn it on my account. I'm not made of glass, Your Grace. I've survived worse than sharp words from a woman in silk. I don't doubt it." His jaw was tight. "That doesn't mean you should have to." He said nothing further, only took the cushion when she offered it, and left, and Miriam sat afterward, wondering at the particular anger that had moved behind his eyes, quiet and banked. The anger of a man who does not raise his voice because he has never needed to, in order to be obeyed, and thinking that whatever else Lady Judith believed about his ordinary courtesy, there had been nothing ordinary in the way he had looked at her just now. She did not know, that evening, that Nathaniel went directly from the sewing-room to his aunt by Marriage's private sitting-room and closed the door behind him, and that the conversation that followed was short and cold, and left Lady Judith with 2 spots of colour high on her cheeks, and a considerably more careful tongue in Mrs. Calder's presence for exactly as long as she believed herself watched. She did not know, either, that this was only the opening exchange in a war Lady Judith had no intention of losing, and that the worst of it was still to come. The worst of it came 3 weeks later, at the small spring gathering the hall held each year for the tenant families, an evening of cider and fiddle music in the long gallery that Nathaniel's father had begun, and Nathaniel had never had the heart to end, even in his griefless years. Miriam had not wanted to come. Mrs. Pruitt had all but ordered her to, on the grounds that half the mending in the room was Miriam's own handiwork, worn proudly by tenant children, and a seamstress ought to see her work admired now and again, or she would forget what it was for. Beth came too, in a dress Miriam had made from a length of blue wool that had once been, before careful unpicking and recutting. Half of the shawl she had wrapped around a beggar boy's feet in the market square 4 months before. The rest of the shawl had gone to a scarf for Oliver, a fact Miriam did not know, since it had been Mrs. Pruitt who quietly salvaged what remained of the ruined wool, and at the Duke's private instruction, had it made into something the boy could keep. Oliver found Beth within the first quarter hour, and did not leave her side after that, which Miriam watched with a private, careful warmth. The 2 children laughing over the fiddle music, while the adults circled each other in more complicated patterns. Lady Judith found her chance near the cider table, in front of enough witnesses to matter, and not so many as to be indecorous about it. "Mrs. Calder," she said, bright and carrying. "How well you look this evening. Is that dress your own work? One would never guess, from the cut of it, that it began life as something so humble." She turned, drawing 2 or 3 nearby guests into her orbit with the ease of long practice. "I do admire resourcefulness in the lower sort. Nathaniel tells me you're quite skilled. Of course, skill of the hands is easily come by. It's rarer, I find, in matters of judgment." "My lady," Miriam said, level, "I'm not certain what you mean. Only that a woman in your position must know her place quite precisely, mustn't she? It would be a great pity for anyone to forget it. Great pities do happen, though, don't they, when ambition outruns birth? I've seen it before. It never ends well for the ambitious party. Never, she smiled the 3 bright beats. I only say this out of kindness. The gallery had gone quieter around them, the way rooms do when they sense blood in the water. Beth, 12 feet away with Oliver, had stopped laughing and was watching her mother with the stricken stillness of a child who understands, without any of the words for it, that someone has just hurt the person she loves most. Miriam set down her cup very carefully. Her hands did not shake. She had trained them a long time for exactly this. "My lady," she said, "I have never once mistaken my place. I mend linens for wages, and I go home each night to my daughter, and I ask nothing of this house beyond what I've earned by the labour of my own 2 hands. If that offends you, I'm sorry for it, but I won't apologise for the hands themselves. They're the only inheritance my father left me, and they've never once let either of us starve." A small silence followed, the particular silence of a room deciding which way to lean. "How very proud," Lady Judith said, though the brightness had thinned in her voice. "Not proud, my lady, only honest. There's a difference, I think, though I understand it isn't always easy to tell one from the other, from where you're standing." She did not raise her voice. She did not look away. She set her empty cup on the table with a small, deliberate click, took Beth's hand, and walked from the gallery with her back straight and her chin level and her eyes dry, and it was not until she was well down the drive, well out of sight of any window that might be watching, that she allowed her hands, finally, to shake. She did not see Nathaniel, who had come into the gallery in time to hear the last of it, standing very still near the far door with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on Lady Judith, with an expression that made the older woman's smile falter and die altogether. She did not see him cross the room to his aunt by marriage, nor hear the low final thing he said to her that made her set down her own glass and leave the gathering early, pleading a headache that fooled no one. She only knew, walking home under a sky gone thick with early stars, that she had endured worse before and would endure it again, and that whatever warmth had been growing in her these past months toward a grave, careful duke, it could not be allowed to grow any further. A woman like Lady Judith did not need to be right to do damage. She only needed to keep speaking, and eventually the damage did itself. Miriam decided that night, lying awake with Beth's steady breathing beside her, that she would give her notice at the hall before the week was out. She gave it 3 days later, in the small sewing room, to Mrs. Pruitt rather than to the Duke, because she did not trust her own voice to hold steady in front of him, and because some part of her, some careful self-protective part that had kept her alive through 3 years of widowhood, understood that if she looked at his face while she said the words, she might lose her nerve entirely. "I'll finish the week's mending," she told Mrs. Pruitt, "and then I think it's best I don't come back." Mrs. Pruitt did not look surprised, which surprised Miriam. The older woman set down the ledger she had been carrying and studied her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite understanding either, something closer to weary recognition. "Is this about her ladyship? It's about doing what's sensible." "Those are rarely the same thing," Mrs. Pruitt said, "in my experience, though I grant you they like to dress themselves up as each other." She was quiet a moment. "You'll break more than one heart leaving this way, and I don't just mean the boys. I have my own to think of first. Do you?" Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were sharp under her grey brows. "And what does your own heart tell you, Mrs. Calder, when it isn't busy being sensible?" Miriam did not answer that. She could not, without saying more than she trusted herself to say, and Mrs. Pruitt, reading the silence correctly, let the matter drop, though not before adding, in a voice gone suddenly gentler than Miriam had ever heard it, "Before you go, there's something you ought to know. I've kept it to myself a long while because it wasn't mine to tell, but I think perhaps it's past time someone did." "What is it?" "Sit down, Mrs. Pruitt said. "This will take a moment, and I think you'll want to be sitting when you hear it." Miriam sat. Mrs. Pruitt drew a chair opposite and folded her hands, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, only looked at Miriam with the careful weighing look of a woman deciding, at last, to set down a burden she had carried a long while on someone else's behalf. "Do you recall the boots that came for your daughter last winter?" Mrs. Pruitt said. "The ones left at your door with no name on the note. I never learnt who sent them." "I know who sent them. I've known since the day they were bought, because I was the one sent to fetch them from the bootmaker in town, with instructions so particular about the size and the fit that I had to guess at your daughter's foot from memory, having only seen her the once." Mrs. Pruitt held Miriam's eyes steadily. "The coal that came the week of the hard frost, the grocer's debt that vanished off your late husband's account, 3 years owed, and never once mentioned to you. The physician sent quietly to see your daughter the week she had that cough that frightened you so, though you never called for him, and never received a bill. All of it, every last piece of it, came from the same hand, and it was never mine, and it was never meant for you to trace." Miriam had gone very still. "Whose, then? You know whose," Mrs. Pruitt said, not unkindly. "You've known some while, I think, without letting yourself know it. The bells in the village tower struck the half-hour, faint through the glass, and Miriam sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling something in her chest come loose and rearrange itself entirely, the way a room looks different once you learn what has been happening in it while your back was turned. "He asked not to be named," Mrs. Pruitt went on. "Every time. That was the one condition on all of it, from the very first week you came to this house. Not gratitude. Not even acknowledgement, only that it be done, and done quietly, and that you never have cause to feel it as a debt." She paused. "I've kept his secrets 11 years, Mrs. Calder, and I'll keep this house's business private till the day I die, but I find I can't sit here and watch you walk out that door believing yourself unwanted, when the truth is very nearly the opposite of that, and has been since before you ever set foot on these grounds." "Since before," Miriam repeated, and something in the phrase snagged at her, some memory not yet fully surfaced. "What do you mean before?" Mrs. Pruitt's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I think that part isn't mine to tell. I think that part is his." Miriam did not sleep that night either, though for entirely different reasons than the nights before it. She lay in the dark, turning over 4 months of small unexplained mercies, coal and boots and a forgiven debt and a physician who left no bill, and beneath them older, a memory she had never fully examined, a man in a plain grey coat standing very still across a market square on the coldest morning of the winter, watching something she had believed no one of consequence would ever see. She rose before dawn, and did not give her notice that week after all. The note came 2 days later, brief and formal on the surface, though Miriam read it a dozen times searching for what lay beneath the formality. It asked her to come to the hall that evening, after the ordinary work was done, and the house had gone quiet, to the small parlour off the library, at her convenience, on a private matter. It was signed simply, Alderley, no further explanation offered. She left Beth with the vicar's wife for the evening, and walked to the hall with her heart doing something unfamiliar and unsteady in her chest. half dread and half a hope she did not trust herself to name. The small parlour was warm. A fire had been built up higher than the room strictly needed, and there was a plainness to it that struck her at once. No footman standing by, no formal chairs arranged for distance, only 2 chairs drawn close to the hearth, and a tray with 2 cups already poured, going cold, as though he had made them himself and then lost his nerve to drink. He rose when she entered. He did not sit again until she had, which she noted, because so few men of his rank thought to wait. "Mrs. Calder," he said, "thank you for coming. Your Grace." "Please," he gestured to the chair. "Sit. I find I have a great deal to say, and I would rather say it to your face than send it to you in a letter I might lose my courage over halfway through writing." She sat. Her hands were steady in her lap, though it cost her something to keep them that way. "I want to tell you something," he began, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you decide what to think of me, because I am aware that some of it will not reflect well, and I have earned whatever judgment you make of it." He was quiet a moment, gathering himself the way a man gathers himself before a confession he has rehearsed many times and still cannot make easy. 4 months ago, on the coldest morning of the winter, my carriage broke a wheel in the Marlow Fen Market Square. I was travelling in a plain coat, unmarked, because I had left in a temper after a disagreement with my aunt by marriage, and had not thought to dress for being recognised. While the wheel was mended, my son and I stood and waited, and in that waiting we watched a woman with a basket break her own family's bread in half to feed a starving child she had never met, and take the shawl from her own shoulders to warm his bare feet in weather cold enough to hurt, and walk away afterward without once looking to see whether anyone had witnessed it. Miriam had gone very still. "I did not know your name that morning," he said. "I learnt it within the hour, and I confess I did not entirely know at first what I meant to do with it. I told myself I only wished to be certain that a single act, however moving, is not proof of a whole character, and that a man in my position cannot simply act on the strength of one morning's impression." His jaw tightened. That was true, as far as it went. It was also a convenient lie, I told myself, because the truth was simpler and frightened me a good deal more. The truth was that I had not been able to stop thinking of you since the moment I saw you kneel in that frost, and I wanted very badly an excuse to be near enough to find out whether the woman I had seen was real, or whether I had simply built her out of my own loneliness and grief. "Your Grace, let me finish," he said gently. "I asked Mrs. Pruitt to bring you into this house under an ordinary offer of work, because I could not think how else to do it honestly. I did not lie to you about the wages, or the work itself, but I did not tell you either that the man who signed nothing on that letter was the same man who had watched you in the square, and I did not tell you, in all the months since, that the coal and the boots and the vanished debt and the physician came from my hand and no other. I told myself I withheld my name from those kindnesses, because true kindness asks nothing in return, and that is not entirely false either. But some part of it, I think, was cowardice. I was afraid that if you knew, you would see only the Duke, and never again the man who stood in a market square and could not look away from you." He stopped. The fire popped once, and neither of them moved for the space of several breaths. "I wanted to see," he said finally, quieter now, "who you were when you believed no one of any consequence was watching. That is the only test, I have come to think, that ever tells the truth about a person. Everyone can be gracious with an audience. Almost no one is generous in an empty square, to a stranger who can give them nothing back. You were. You have been, every day since, in 100 small ways I doubt you've even noticed yourself doing. That is why I am telling you all of this now, plainly, and asking nothing of you in return, except that you know it. Miriam sat with her hands folded very tightly in her lap, and for a long moment she did not trust her voice at all. You've been watching me, she said finally, for 4 months. Yes, testing me. At the start, not for very long. It did not take long, Mrs. Calder, to see that there was nothing in you that needed testing. He held her eyes. I have spent the rest of the time simply watching you be exactly who you are, and finding that I did not want to stop. She stood then, needing the movement, and crossed to the window, where the dark garden lay quiet beyond the glass, and she was silent long enough that he did not press her, only waited, the way she had noticed he always waited, without demanding that her silence resolve itself on his schedule rather than her own. I don't know what to do with this, she said at last, to the window rather than to him. You don't have to do anything with it tonight. You concealed who you were from me. For months. I did. Even after I began to trust you. Yes, his voice did not flinch from it. I have no defence for that part beyond the truth, which is that I was afraid, not of you, of what it would mean to be seen for exactly who I am by someone whose good opinion I had come to want more than I have wanted anything in a very long while, and to lose it. She turned back to face him. Her eyes were dry. She had learned long ago not to let them be otherwise, but there was something naked in her face now that she had stopped trying to guard. I need time, she said. Then you shall have it. As much as you like. I will not ask you for an answer tonight, or this week, or press you toward one before you're ready to give it freely. Whatever you decide, I want it to be yours, and yours alone, made with the whole truth in front of you, rather than half of it. He paused. I would rather have your honest no, given in your own time, than a yes you felt obliged to give me because of everything I've told you tonight. I have had a marriage built on obligation once already. I find I have no wish to build another one the same way. She looked at him a long moment, this grave, careful man who had just handed her, without pressure, without demand, the entire weight of her own choosing, and something in her chest that had been braced for months finally, quietly, let go. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Thank you, he said, for the bread. She almost smiled at that, the strange doubled shape of it, each of them thanking the other for the opposite thing, and she left the hall that night with no answer given and none demanded, and walked home under a sky gone clear and cold and bright with stars, turning the whole of it over in her mind the entire way. She did not go back to the hall the next day, nor the day after that. She told herself she needed the distance to think clearly, and it was true, though it was also true that some part of her was simply afraid of what she would find in her own chest the next time she stood in the same room as him. She spent those days doing ordinary things. She mended a neighbour's shirt. She taught Beth her letters by the fire in the evening, the way she always had, and found herself watching her daughter's small determined hand shape out the alphabet, and thinking, unbidden, of a boy of 7 who had tugged his father's sleeve in a market square and said, "Look at her hands," and she thought that perhaps the whole of a person's character could be read exactly there, in the small things they noticed when no one had asked them to notice anything at all. She thought, too, of Lady Judith, and of the particular cruelty of a woman who had never once had to prove her own worth, and she found, turning it over, that she was no longer quite so afraid of her. A woman who needed to diminish others to feel tall, had already told Miriam everything she needed to know about the actual height of her. On the 5th day, Mrs. Pruitt came to the cottage herself, on foot, which was unusual enough that Miriam knew before the older woman had said a word that something had shifted at the hall. "Her ladyship's gone, Mrs." Pruitt said, without preamble, settling herself at the small table with the particular satisfaction of a woman delivering news she had waited a long while to deliver. "His Grace had words with her the morning after the tenants' gathering, and further words after you gave your notice, and this morning she packed her trunks for Bath, where I understand she has a sister who will tolerate her considerably less than we did." She allowed herself a small dry smile. He was very plain with her, I'm told her that a woman who could not treat a good person kindly, regardless of that person's birth, had no place under his roof, kin or not. She wept about it to anyone who'd listen, on her way out the door, and found rather fewer listeners than she expected. Miriam absorbed this in silence. "He hasn't been himself this week, Mrs." Pruitt added, more gently. "Doesn't eat properly, snaps at no one, which is somehow worse than if he snapped at everyone, because it means he's keeping it all inside where it does the most damage. The boy asks after you every day, wants to know when you're coming back to fix his sleeves, though I don't think that's really what he's asking. Mrs. Pruitt, I'm not here to press you," the housekeeper said. "I promised him I wouldn't, and I keep my promises, whatever else people say of housekeepers who talk too much." Her eyes were kind. "I'm only here because I've watched that man carry grief around like a stone in his coat for 2 years, and I've watched it start to loosen, these past months, for the first time since his wife died, and I thought you ought to know that. Whatever you decide, it isn't pressure. It's only information. What you do with it is your own." She left soon after, and Miriam sat a long while at her own small table once she had gone, looking at nothing in particular, and it was Beth, finally, who broke the silence, looking up from her slate with the plain, unclouded logic of a child who has not yet learned to complicate simple things. "Do you love him, Mama?" Miriam looked at her daughter. "That's a very grown-up question. You didn't answer it." "No," Miriam admitted. "I didn't." She went to the hall the next morning. He was in the library when she arrived, unannounced, and he rose so quickly at the sight of her in the doorway that he nearly upset the inkstand on his desk, which was, she thought, the least ducal thing she had ever seen him do. And she found she liked him rather better for it. "Mrs. Calder Miriam," she said. "I think, after everything, you might call me Miriam." Something moved across his face, quick and unguarded, gone before she could fully name it, though she thought it might have been the nearest thing to joy she had ever seen him allow himself. "Miriam," he said, testing the shape of it. "I've been calling you Mrs. Calder in my head for 4 months, and Miriam in my heart the entire time. It's a relief to be able to say it aloud. That's a very fine thing to say to a woman who came here to give you an answer." "Then give it," he said. "Whatever it is. I find I can bear it better than I can bear this waiting." She crossed the room to stand before him, close enough now that she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes properly, and she found, standing there, that her hands were steady, entirely steady, in a way they had not been in a very long while. "I want to be spoken to plainly," she said. "Always, not managed, not protected from hard truths, because you've decided I'm too poor or too tired to bear them. Plainly, the way you spoke to me that night by the fire, even when it cost you something to do it. You'll have it. I give you my word. I want to keep my own hands," she said. "My work. It's little enough, I know, next to everything else in your world, but it's mine, and I built it out of nothing when I had nothing else. and I won't be made to set it down and call myself grateful for the setting down. I would never ask you to. And I never want to wonder again, she said, quieter now, whether the kindness in front of me has a name attached that I'm not being told. If you do a good thing, I want to know it's you. Not because I need thanking for loving you, only because I don't want to spend the rest of my life learning the truth in pieces, the way I learnt it this time. You have my whole name, he said, and everything that comes with it, plainly given, from this moment forward, for as long as you'll have it. She looked at him a long moment, this grave, careful man who had watched her in a frost-bound square, and loved her, it seemed, from that very hour, without ever once needing her to be anything grander than exactly what she was. Yes, she said. It was the only word she needed, and she gave it plainly, the way she meant to give everything else from then on. He reached for her hand, and stopped, and asked, with his eyes rather than his voice, whether he might, and she nodded, and he drew the glove from her fingers slowly, one finger at a time, the wool worn thin at every knuckle, and pressed his mouth to her bare palm, to the roughened skin that Lady Judith had once named as evidence of everything Miriam was not, and that Nathaniel had come, in 4 short months, to consider the finest thing he had ever had the privilege to hold. Your hands, he said, against her palm, are the best thing in this house. I intend to spend a good many years telling you so, until you finally believe it. They were married quietly, that summer, in the small stone church where Miriam's own father had once preached, with none of the grandeur the title might have demanded, and every bit of the warmth the day deserved. Beth in a new blue dress at the front pew with Oliver solemnly beside her, holding her hand the way he had held it since a spring evening over cider and fiddle music. And Mrs. Pruitt weeping openly in the back row, and denying it to anyone who asked. A year later, on an evening gone soft with early frost, the household gathered by the fire in the same small parlour where a confession had once been made, and Nathaniel sat with Miriam's bare hand laced in her wedding band catching the firelight, and did not let go of it, not once, the entire evening. While Beth and Oliver argued cheerfully over a game of draughts on the hearthrug, and the wind came up outside the way it always came up that time of year, smelling of wood smoke and the first hard frost. Of Lady Judith there came, twice a year, a brief and correctly worded letter from Bath, thanking the Duke for his continued generosity toward her small allowance, and asking after no one by name. Nathaniel read each one, folded it once, and set it aside without comment, which was, Mrs. Pruitt observed privately, exactly the fate such letters deserved. The boy from the market square, it emerged, had been an orphan with no family to claim him, and had been placed, at the Duke's quiet instruction and expense, with a kind family 2 villages over, who had wanted a son, and had never once been told the name of the benefactor who made it possible, only that a gentleman in the county had asked, particularly, not to be named. On the mantel of that small parlour, in a plain wooden frame Miriam had chosen herself, sat not a portrait, but a single pressed square of blue wool, the last scrap left over from an old shawl once wrapped around a stranger's frozen feet, kept now for no reason either of them could fully explain, except that it seemed wrong to let it go, and every evening, when the fire was lit and the bread was set warm and whole in the centre of the table, plenty where there had once been none, Miriam thought of the morning she had broken her own loaf in half for a child who could never repay her, and understood, finally, that the world did sometimes notice what it saw when it believed itself unwatched, and answered it, in its own slow time. with everything a person had never thought to ask for. Character, in the end, is only ever what a person does when they believe no one of consequence is watching, and the truest wealth any house ever holds is the kind that was given away first, and asked for nothing back. If this story warmed something quiet in you tonight, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and stay for the next one. I'd love to know in the comments what you think became of that barefoot boy at the well, now that he's grown, and whether he ever learned the name of the woman who broke her own bread for him. Tell me what you'd have done, in Miriam's place, on that frozen morning, with a hungry child of your own at your side. Thank you for staying with this story to its very last line. Come back soon. There is always another quiet kindness waiting to be told, and another Duke learning, the hard way, what it truly means to be seen.